In this episode, we interview founder of the Honeynet Project and noted honeypot expert Lance Spitzner. Get a perspective on cyber deception from one of the folks who's been involved in this industry practically from the beginning. Coming up on Take Back the Advantage. So deception has been around for a long time, and we're going to talk about a fascinating example really quick. Back in the Cold War, the Soviets were working to build a natural gas pipeline. The problem is that they needed technology to be able to do that. Now, the U.S. at this time was made aware of a document called the Farewell Dossier, provided to them by a high-level KGB officer through the French. And this dossier, this farewell dossier, described how the Soviets were staying basically technologically competitive with the U.S. by stealing or secretly purchasing technology, such as radar, control systems, semiconductors, that kind of stuff. So this document also contained a list of literally hundreds of Soviet agents and the people who they were buying technology from. So on one hand, once you have that list, what you could do is swat the mosquito. You round up all of those people, you deport them, you arrest them, whatever, and the threat is now gone. At least the problem is that the known threat is now gone. So there was an economist, and this was during the Reagan administration, it's a guy named Gus Weiss. And what he said, he made a recommendation, and he basically, and this is a quote from me, he's like, why not help the Soviets with their shopping? Now that we know what they want, we can help them get it. So as part of this, the plan was, if we know what the Soviets are looking for, we can give them what they're looking for. But, and the caveat is that, for example, if it's a computer chip, the computer chips would be designed to pass Soviet quality checks. In other words, they're going to, on the surface, work, but they're going to fail in actual operations. So as part of this, the Soviets sent a KGB agent to a Canadian company to steal some specific technology. And because the U.S. had advanced knowledge of that, they actually worked with the Canadians to modify the technology to cause pumps and turbines and valves and things like that would be used for controlling that gas pipeline to malfunction. And the result of this was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever seen from space. It was a 2-kiloton blast in a remote area in Siberia. There were no known fatalities, but this had a huge impact on the Soviets. It's not like they could go complain that their stolen technology was bad. And because as far as they were concerned, everything passed all their preliminary testing, they now had to be suspicious of every other piece of technology that they quote unquote acquired, right? So this is a really cool example of deception in that we know what our adversaries are looking for. And because of that, we can give them what they think they want, but do so in a way that negatively impacts their ability to cause us harm. And we can do this in the cyber world as well. The other kind of takeaway from that is that the Soviets became aware that deception had been used against them, but that only created a bigger problem for the Soviets, because once they became aware of deception, now they had to question everything that was being presented. And that, it made their processes even more difficult. And again, if we do that in the cyber world, we have the same thing. So a little bit of history from a deception perspective. For this week, we are going to be interviewing Lance Spitzner. So Lance is the director of SANS Security Awareness. He's also a member of the board of advisors for Ativo Networks. He's also was the president and the founder of the Honeynet Project. So I guess one could say he's sort of the father, the grandfather, even though he's not old, of deception. He's authored books on deception, Honeypots, Tracking Hackers. I believe they've been translated into at least a couple of different languages. I looked on Amazon and I found that book translated both into Japanese and Chinese. I'm like, very cool. So Lance, anything you want to add? Once you other than my web scraped bio from you, what do you want to tell everybody about yourself?
Well, first of all, I love that story you just told, because it really gives you a broad idea of all the things that deception can do. Deception can be very tactical, getting the bad guys to go left when they should be going right. But also you can fundamentally attack them at a very strategic level. And deception is not just about collecting information about the bad guys, but giving the bad guys bad information about you. So both the tactical and strategic level, and it's both about taking in and giving out information. About myself, I would say I've been in cybersecurity for over 20 years. The first 10 years were very much on the technical side to include honeypots, cyber intel. And the last 10 years, I've kind of shifted more to the human side because that's where my passion is. But honestly, it's where I feel we can make the biggest difference.
Awesome. Awesome. And if you really think about it, if you think about the deception stuff, I mean, as much as anything, that's sort of the perfect blend of the human side and the technical side, because the technology of deception is interesting, but the technology isn't the goal of deception. When you implement a firewall, the firewall is the goal. When you implement deception, the technology isn't the goal, it's the avenue that we use to change and influence the behavior of our adversaries. So there's the human aspect of it as well as the technological aspect of it.
Yeah, and that's why I've always said for deception to really work, the bad guy has to interact with your technology, has to consume the information or the output from that interaction, and then they have to act on it. So what ends up happening is if the bad guys don't consume and act, then the deception doesn't work. So a fantastic book about deception at the World War II level is a book called The Deceivers. And deception worked very well with the Germans because the Germans had extremely good military intelligence groups and they could be fooled. So what would happen is the Allies would set up deception, the Germans would consume that information and then act on that information in the way the Allies wanted. But the book points out deception never worked with the Japanese. They tried it. The problem is that the Japanese didn't have good military intelligence. So not only were the Japanese not intaking information, but even if they did not act on it. So oddly enough, they found it hard to deceive the Japanese because their military intelligence at that time was in many ways dysfunctional. And what was interesting is on the flip side, the book also points out the Italians were very hard to deceive because the Italians, like the Germans, had very good military intelligence, but they've been doing the whole deception thing at a political strategic level for thousands of years, Machiavellian approach. So it was interesting. They found the Italians hard because they were so good, but they found the Japanese were hard to deceive because they were so bad. It's just the Germans were at that sweet spot.
Yeah, it seems like it's one of those things where if you are good enough at deception, like in the case of the Italians, you start thinking that way all the time. If you're not, and you start being suspect of everything, you start sort of second guessing and analyzing. There's an interesting, back in the 80s, the CIA wrote a paper on the 10 maxims of deception. And so those 10 maxims of deception, one of those was actually called Jones's lemma or lema. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It wasn't coined by the guy Jones, Professor R.V. Jones, but it was quite often stated by him. And what it says is that deception becomes more difficult as the number of channels of information available to the victim increases. However, within limits, the greater number of controlled channels, the greater the likelihood of deception being believed. In other words, if I held up a picture to the camera here of just my face and it was a realistic picture, it might come across very realistic. But if I turn sideways, then you're going to obviously see that it's just a picture as opposed to the real thing. The more different avenues that you have to look at something, the harder it is to come up with that complete deceptive picture. But if you can come up with that complete deceptive picture, then it's much more likely to be believed. And I find that to be a really fascinating thing. And if you look at something like, the Italians versus the Germans, I think maybe part of the difference is that the Italians were just looking at stuff from as many different perspectives as they could because they were expecting deception. The Germans, more likely than not, kind of thought they knew things and would just use their confidence against them because they believed because they had such good military intelligence that they weren't that they had the right picture, which is a really cool thing to do.
Very
So
cool.
let me ask you this. So we've talked about deception, and you've been involved in deception, whether it's been called that for quite some time. How would you say that deception today is different from what it was when you were kind of in the midst of the Honeynet Project?
I would say two big things. So 20 years ago, deception or honeypots, whatever you want to call it, but deception was like honeypots plus lots of other stuff now. Back then, it was extremely manual, extremely ground up, think skunkworks. So back then, you had to develop all your technology, deploy, maintain, and analyze. So very, very, very time consuming. Nowadays, the technology is automated. You have artificial intelligence, machine learning, but you also have cloud, you've got containers. So it's the perfect world to automate what 20 years ago was painful to do. But on the flip side, I would say it's far more valuable. So 20 years ago, you were dealing primarily the threat actors 20 years ago were script kiddies, cyber criminals, things like that. People were either playing or using highly automated tools. Nowadays, it's highly nation state, but it's also very human manual intensive. So there was a time when deception really didn't have a big impact 15 years ago because everything was automated. It was all botnets, viruses, worms. Can't deceive that. Deception really ultimately only works if there's a human behind the keyboard. So what happens is nowadays with nation state, espionage, targeted cyber criminal, there more often is a human behind the keyboard. So with the advance in technology, it's easier. And with the bad guys more actively consuming and acting on information, deception can also now be more effective.
Awesome. Yeah. So there was another quote, and I don't remember who said it, and I may put the references to it in the show notes once I get this thing posted. But so the quote was basically, deception is a mind game played between humans. And this was, again, in the context of military. And they were talking about the camouflage and the fake tanks and all of those, the RF emissions and the communications and all that. Those are just the tools that we use to deliver a message to another human being. And that kind of goes to your point with respect to, if you're dealing with an automated process, deception isn't necessary. I mean, deception can help because you can do some detection and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the key with deception is it's about influencing the behavior of the adversary in making them do or influencing them to do what we want them to do. Now, maybe it's just get caught, but maybe it's also to take actions that give away their identity, that disclose their TTPs, their techniques and practices and all that. So there is this human aspect to it, which I think is really, really fascinating. And I would go so far as to say that is actually, in a nutshell, one of the reasons why defensively we've been losing for decades. Because traditional security controls have always pit a human being, the attacker, against technology, which is static. And when a human goes up against technology, the human wins invariably at some point in time. But with deception, we are now creating a situation where we can actually have a human being, the attacker, who is now effectively going up against another human being, the person that's planning and designing and implementing deception. And because deception can do such an effective job at detecting the bad guys very quickly, now we can reallocate resources from tuning our IDS and our SIM to actively engaging with the attacker. Not necessarily hacking back, but changing the picture, changing the deceptive story in the face of the attack in real time, potentially. Now, we're not quite there yet, but that is, I think, where things go. What do you think in terms of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, the whole idea, like you said, is to influence the human behavior. So that is what ultimately our goal is. And that's one of the things I always tell people. Now, if you want to deploy deception, that's fantastic. But what's ultimately your goal? So what, a lot of people at a basic level, detection, because it is fantastic. It's such a simple thing. It eliminates all the noise. But if you want to pump up the volume, absolutely.
Yeah, and so what would you say if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, Lance, you've been doing this stuff for a long time. I want to go and I want to talk. I think this deception stuff is cool, but I want to be able to go talk to my boss, right? I want to be able to talk to my boss about the real benefits of deception, convince them that this is something we should go ahead and take a look at." What's the message?
Well, it depends who your boss is, what your goal is, things like that. So like I said, the first thing I love about deception, or just honeypots in general, is detection. The problem you have with most detection technologies, and we're throwing so many out there, is detection technologies go, okay, I have to learn what normal is, then let me look for abnormal. That's really hard. We haven't gotten that good at it. Honeypots and deception itself, honey tokens, whatever you want to talk it, vastly simplify it. They go, we don't care what normal is. Well, all that we know is any interaction with us is by definition abnormal. So your signal to noise ratio is just amazing. Honeypots are a fantastic detection tool. So if you want to go in and simplify detection, boom. Now, for organizations that have more mature security programs, more mature advanced threat models, the other thing I would go there and throw at them, look, this is a fantastic, low-cost, simple way to really start detecting, gathering, and stop messing with and stopping the bad guys. Because what people don't realize is deception technology is fundamentally so simple. And as Bruce Schneier likes to tell us, complexity is the enemy of simple. So for what, when you're introducing a lot of simplicity, but B, like you said, it's throwing an obstacle to the bad guy. You detect him a lot faster, you break him a lot faster, and you can start giving him bad information, breaking him at even a strategic level.
Absolutely, and that kind of goes back to that concept of the little story that I talked to earlier with respect to the Cold War and the swatting the mosquito concept. A lot of times when bad guys are detected on our networks, our first response is swat the mosquito, kick them off the network. But if you do that, you are effectively getting rid of some really important actionable threat intelligence. Because at least if nothing else, you know the IP address of the guy that's coming at you. And you know where they are, and you can have at least a beat on them so you can start watching them. And that's where I think deception allows us to change our behaviors. We don't have to it becomes so much easier to detect the bad guys that we don't have to just get rid of them right away. We can keep an eye on them. If they start getting too close to something that's a big deal, yeah, we can kick them off the network. But as long as they're on the network, we know their IP address, we can collect information about what they're doing, we can better understand our adversary. And at the same point in time, as long as they're over there messing around in our honeypots, we don't really have to worry. And that, I mean, think about how much money people pay for sort of generic threat intelligence, right? It might be industry specific or whatever. But they pay a lot of money for that. And that's not even very specific to the organization or the incident. When you detect somebody via deception, that is threat intel that is gold. So it does change some of the opportunities for behavior. We don't have to swat that mosquito. We can use that to learn because we now have control over that situation, which is super awesome stuff.
The problem that the bad guy now has is anytime he's operating in your environment, he's now got to second guess himself. Two other things too is keep in mind the moment you've detected them, you can redirect them into like a sandbox network where they can bounce around, and since they're in a contained fishbowl, they can't do any harm. Yep. The other one that I always feel interesting is people will bring up, well, gee, that brings up extra risk. What if they break out of the honeypot? They're already in your network. Remember, the honeypots of today aren't on the outside of your network. They're embedded deep within throughout your network. And if a bad guy starts playing with one of your honeypots, that means A, he's already in your network. B, you didn't know it. So yep. I've never understood this idea of, well, they introduce more risk. How do they introduce more risk? Because if the bad guy's on it, that means he's already in your network and you didn't know. So where's the added risk?
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's almost like there's a perception that there's additional risk because I now know about it, right? It was always there, right? I mean, let's face it. I would rather have a bad guy on my network that I know about than a bad guy that I don't know about. And let's face it, is there a difference? Not really. I mean, barring me doing anything about it, bad guys on my network either way, I reduce my risk by knowing about it. I further reduce my risk by learning more about what the attacker's going to do, which is going to allow me to develop better controls and allow me to respond more effectively. So I agree with you. I think that I think that that perception sort of comes from what a lot of people did in the early days of honeypots, which was, we're going to create a hacker zoo. We're going to create an environment that's completely separate from our production environment, that we're going to let people hack, and we're going to go watch them. And in those days, and again, technology was much less advanced than it is today, if I let a bad guy into my fake little network and I didn't control that enough, and if the bad guy then used that to launch attacks against other things, maybe there's an issue there. But that's not how deception is done today. We're actually, as you said, we're integrating this stuff deep into our networks. We're not creating just some secondary, hacker zoo. What we're doing is creating a situation where we control, we have visibility, all that kind of stuff. So I agree with you. I don't think that's a huge, big deal. So what would you say when it comes to deception? This is one of those topics that a lot of people, they don't. A lot of people don't understand it. Those people who do understand it are maybe a little wary of it because they perceive it to be something new. Now, I would say that we're talking about concepts that have been around for a few thousand years, and we're talking about technology that the root of it's been around for a few decades, but it's being packaged in a way that might be a little bit new. And I think organizations are wary, right? Oh, we bought this IDS. Everybody told us it was awesome, and now we have 3 full-time employees tuning it every single day. We bought this, user and entity behavioral analytics solution. We bought it a year and a half ago. It's still not deployed because we're still trying to normalize our network. What should people know when it comes to deception? What are the biggest mistakes that you see when people do when they attempt to get involved in deception?
Well, keep in mind, it's a sliding scale too. You can just dabble it in a little bit, or you can jump all in. So you can start really, really, really simple. Just put a very simple basic system on your network and see if anything starts interacting with it. We have badness. Or you could sprinkle a couple of honey tokens, URLs, fake login accounts. I mean, you don't even need fancy technology. So you can do some very basic deceptions, and they're just more triggers from a detection point of view. So detection is that bottom layer of what I would call value, and it's the simplest, fastest ROI. But if you want to take that sliding scale to the other extreme, then you can go ahead and have automated tools that look at what your network traffic, see what's happening, replicate systems that mirror that type of activity. Oh, you're running Windows? We run Windows. You've got Cisco? We'll pop up Cisco. And then you can put those in, almost like farms or technologies that are isolated in these fishbowl environments. So when the bad guys then interact with the technologies, you can dump them in these fishbowl environments without them know, isolated, safe, watch, gather intelligence, and or if you want, just shut them down. All you're doing is vastly improving your detection, response, threat intelligence, and resilience. So it's a sliding scale. And like I said, if you want to go in small and slow, fantastic.
Yeah, in the a couple weeks ago, I did an interview with Ativo's Tony Cole,
Yep.
and at the end of that, I had a little technical segment where I showed how you can use something like Netcat for deception, and actually, showed a simple Netcat listener, but also went into, all right, well, what if I want to get this stuff reporting to syslog? Here's how we can do that. What if we want to make it so that if somebody connects up to this port on Netcat, we're going to create a dynamic firewall rule to actively block that person? And And we showed how to do that. So to your point, deception is one of those things where, I mean, let's face it, imagine you're the person that just pops up a simple netcat listener and catches the bad guy the day they got on the network, right? Imagine the win that that is. I mean, that's amazing stuff. But to your point, it scales up, right? You can get enterprise class deception solutions, and you can go all the way down to throw on a couple of pieces here and there. And I think it's also one of those technologies that literally fits every single organization and does it in a way that scales pretty well with organizational size. Little tiny organizations, it's pretty easy to do. Big giant organizations, well, it's going to be more complex, but it's going to be in line with that sort of scale, which I think is really cool. So if I'm interested in if I'm interested in deception, what would you say? I mean, I will put a caveat here. I tell people all the time, if you want to get involved in deception, just do it, right? There's not really a lot of prerequisites. It's a good additional technology. It's not a rip and replace anything else. It works and plays well with everything else that you already have. But to me, it would seem that there are certain things that would be beneficial to understand before you start jumping into deception. What are some of the things that you would say to an organization? All right, we want to deploy deception rather than just going and buying a technology. We want to be ready. What would you say are the prerequisites for deception? And I say prerequisites not as mandatory, but what would be the best things for organizations to do ahead of deploying deception?
Well, number one, what do you want to achieve? And what I tend to find is organizations with a less mature program, detection. Like I said, be honest, deception is where I would go first. Yeah, you got IDS and SIMs and all sorts of fancy AI floating out there. But you know what? Deception is such a simple approach. It can radically make far more efficient. So first, what's your goal? And if it's detection, you go one way. If it's pumping up the volume, you want to gather intel on the bad guy, or you want to give the bad guy bad intel, redirects, things like that, that's going to pump up the volume a little bit. So A, what's your goal? B, start slow. So how I would start is, like I said, I'd love the idea of honey tokens. Create some fake accounts. See how that plays out. Go out and put some bad data, some bad, fake credit card numbers, fake PII, some things like that. If all of a sudden you're detecting that on your perimeter, we have badness, or somebody's making a mistake. Don't forget accidental, but still, either way, it's bad. We want to detect and stop it. So sprinkle honey tokens, fake data, fake accounts, some URLs, maybe one or two, just some very simplistic honeypots from a detection perspective, just to play. And the neat thing too is a lot of those vendors out there, like Ativo, those deception vendors, will be happy to go, hey, you want to put a box on just to see what this works? And they'll be thrilled because they know the moment you put one of these boxes in your network, lights are going to be going off. So they're not concerned about, is it going to just demonstrate ROI? They want you to try it out. So I would say go in slow, get confident, and then figure out how far you really want to take it.
And I think that going slow, and you're talking about just creating like little honey tokens and stuff. I mean, this doesn't require any new technology. I mean, you can set up, a Windows computer, throw some, some files that appear to be sensitive, enable something like audit object access in the Windows auditing rules, and just audit anytime anybody touches those specific files. It's already there. You could do similar things on Linux. Something like a netcat listener, super easy. You don't even need to throw up full-blown virtualized solutions when we can just do containerized virtualization with Docker or LXC or things like that to make it super, super, super simple. And the way that I look at it is the biggest, I see the biggest sort of difficulty in getting deception deployed is just people's resistance to the unknown, the resistance to change, the resistance to doing something that's different. And I think that low and slow approach is such an easy thing to do. It doesn't require even purchasing technology. It doesn't require a lot of work effort. It doesn't require a lot of care and feeding. And if it doesn't catch anything, what have you lost? A few minutes of work. But if it does catch something, you have gained an advantage like none other.
Yep.
And one of the things that I always say this, and this is like, you know, I bring this up kind of ad nauseum when I talk about deception, but we look at, you know, there's a common saying, right? Attackers need to be right once, defenders need to be right 100% of the time. And it's a bit of an oversimplification because that sort of assumes that our networks are just like an eggshell. You crack it once and it's dead. But it does illustrate a point where mistakes on the part of the attackers don't really cost the attackers all that much, but mistakes on the part of defenders cost us a lot. So when the bad guy gets on our network and we implement deception, the bad guys aren't going to come into contact with all of our deceptive resources. In fact, they may intentionally avoid many of them because they detect them or they're being really careful. But the fact of the matter is, how many of them do they need to interact with before they're caught? One, right? So we now create a situation where once the bad guy's on our network, quite literally, the attacker now needs to be right 100% of the time, and the defenders need to be right once. And that is such a game-changing thing. So let me ask you this. What do you think? Let's assume that deception has now become the norm, right? It is now what everybody is doing. What impact does that have on the world of cybersecurity?
Well, basically two things. A, we're going to be far better informed about the bad guys because our cyber intelligence capabilities have dramatically increased. I would see two, you'd see a massive impact to bad guys' dwell time because our ability to detect and respond would vastly improve. But three, we're adding a lot of friction to the bad guys' world. Now they have to go in a little softer, assume every time they get a data, well, is it deception data or is it valid data? So we're making their lives far more difficult, slowing them down, and ultimately they can do less harm. So greater resilience on our end, far more friction on theirs.
Yeah, I often say that I can envision a situation at some point in time in the future where it may actually be easier to physically compromise a facility to not get caught than to try to do it over the wire. Because if deception is being implemented as it can be, like, in other words, if we look at the theoretical maximum of what we can do from a deception perspective, I think it changes the game to a level that we've never seen before. Right? It's just some crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. So let's take I'm going to go back to the same question about what do people need in order to get ready for deception. But I'm gonna flip it around, right? So now we've just implemented some deception solution that is appropriate for our organization. What are the things that you think that organizations are going to be surprised by once they get it put in place, or what are the things that they might, not have considered? So this is sort of the same question of what do they need to do to get ready for it, but what do they need to expect once it's in?
I would say, based on my experience, two surprises. And they'll ultimately, it's always how fast and how well it works. So the first surprise is going to almost always be when you deploy the technology, how fast it finds something. Now, it may not be a bad guy. It may be there's something else weird, but A, how fast you get findings. Two, like I said, sometimes it's weirdness. So one organization worked with vulnerability management, vulnerability scanning. So what they were doing is vulnerability management was reporting, hey, we're scanning all the networks, nothing major found. And then the deception team said, when you were scanning all the networks, none of our honeypots ever picked up any scanning. So you weren't scanning those networks. And the vulnerability management team's like, oh, but we're scanning everything. And then the deception team's like, here's our data, we didn't see you. And the vulnerability management team went back and went, oh, yeah, you're right. We're only actively scanning half of our systems. So what I tend to find is, A, the biggest surprise is how fast you learn something. But B, how often it's not just about bad guys you're learning about, but deficiencies, accidentals, or issues on your side, because you're getting much better visibility on what you are or what you're not doing.
Yeah. I think that is huge. And I would say, to add on to that, if you deploy deception, you better have a good incident response program because you're going to use it.
Yep.
And be ready for that, right? Because next thing you know, you suddenly find you got 5 attackers on your network that you didn't know about. If you're not ready to actively respond to that, then things get crazy and stressful, right? And that's not a good thing. So that's huge. So as we talk about deception, um, this concept of speed and being able to find things and all that. So one of the things that I oftentimes hear is, well, wait a minute, insider threats. If the insiders already know that deception's being used, it's not going to work against them. If the attackers discover that deception is being used, it's not going to work against them. A corollary to that is I've heard of a lot of customers. I've talked to a lot of customers that don't want to admit that they're using deception because they're afraid that that's going to reduce the impact, which is, as a sidebar, a little challenging, because one of the biggest pushbacks that I get is, if deception's so good, why isn't everybody using it? And I would say that is perhaps even a false question, because we don't know who's using it because nobody wants to talk about it. So is this something that should be a big, deep, dark secret, or is this something that we can have out in the open and still be effective?
It's going to have to be a little bit of both, because for right or wrong, you're spot on. I know a lot of organizations that are using it and will never say anything about it. For all you know, organizations that are poo-pooing deception are doing it because they're huge believers of it and want to be sure that the bad guys don't realize they're big believers of it. So yeah, obviously you've got a bit of a marketing issue, because people who by nature use deception want to be quiet about deception. But also the idea of, if people detect it, then does that impact the value? Well, something I've always suggested is this. Once again, take deception to the next level. If I were going to use deception and I was concerned the bad guys would detect it, I would take some very basic, simple deception technologies that I know the bad guys would detect, and I'd push them out there. So the bad guys would go in, okay, guys, look for deception. Oh, we found it there, and there. Well, ha, 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 they're using basic stuff. We're so good. And you're just putting these triggers out there so they find it. Then you've got your real deception, another layer. So once they think they found it, then their little tingly spider sensors go back down to normal. Then your real deception can kick in and cause damage. So you can play this game back and forth to multiple levels.
Oh yeah, and that actually gets down to, so one of the things that I've been doing some research on is trying to quantify and come up with taxonomies around deception. And so one of the concepts that I came across is there's these 4 terms. One is called essential elements of deceptive information, and then there's essential elements of friendly information, non-essential elements of deceptive information, and non-essential elements of friendly information. So what we're talking about there, an essential element of deceptive information. This is the deception that we are going to keep secret, right? This is what we don't want people to know about, right? An essential element of friendly information is the information that we are going to make available, like the production information that's going to be visible. But you also have what we call non-essential elements of deceptive information. This is deception that we disclose. This is giving away the deception because that can affect the bad guy's behavior. And there may also be some super secret information that we also disclose out there, those non-essential elements of friendly information, because sometimes when we give the bad guys a bit of good information combined with a bit of bad information, it makes the bad information more believable. So to your point, sometimes sometimes it might be fine to let people know that we're using deception because it could be a deterrent, right? I don't want to attack this environment. They're using deception. I'm scared. I'm going to leave. But even if that doesn't happen, once we expose it to them, we can both give the attacker at the same time a sense of overconfidence and a sense of insecurity, which is weird. But we're basically saying, here's our deception. And the attacker's like, ooh, that's kind of scary, but I discovered it. As you said, I'm awesome. I'm fantastic. And we've got secondary levels of deception that they don't become aware of, and they're not even looking for it because they've already found what they thought is the answer. And these are the mind games that we play. And the cool thing about this is that the story that we present isn't a function of the technology that we use. We use the technology to give the message, but the technology doesn't design the story. It doesn't define the story. So we can modify our deceptive cover story anytime we want. So if the bad guy seems to get onto us, we change the story in real time using the same technology we already have, which I think is an amazingly powerful thing that we are dynamically changing our security environment based on our knowledge of the attacker. And we generally don't do that. What are your thoughts along those things?
No, I would agree on those points there. Overall, it's also an evolving technology that you can really customize to your needs and culture. So don't pin yourself in a box what deception can or can't do. It's it can be a very tactical tool, detection, or it can be a very strategic tool, collect information and give bad information. So it's very, very flexible to whatever your overall needs are.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I know we're getting sort of towards the end of the hour here, and we've been talking deception, but I know you're also doing a lot of stuff with SANS with respect to securing the human and their security awareness stuff. So I want to give you an opportunity to just kind of give your 2 cents on that stuff if you want to, as we wrap things up. Might as well take the opportunity.
Yeah, just real quick. So deception is all about trying to get the bad guys to do what you want them to do. So I've now flipped to the other side and I'm working with the good guys and I'm trying to get the good guys to do what we want them to do. So my passion and job now is helping organizations build robust security awareness and culture programs that help drive the secure behaviors we all need to stop the bad guys. So you could say the first 10 years, I focused on the human side, getting bad guys to do what we want. And now the past 10 years have been focused on getting the good guys to do what we want. Either way, ultimately, security is about people, not technology. There's always a person behind the keyboard. So if you want to really have a fundamental impact, both on offense and defense, you've got to focus first on the human.
Awesome. So here's what I'm looking. So I just took you a little juxtaposition between deception and like security awareness and good guy stuff. What I'm looking for is that we start implementing deception concepts in security awareness training.
Yeah, we could go there. I'm not sure if I'd want to start there, but we could definitely look at that.
I don't know how that works, but it was, as you were saying it, I'm like, I wonder if we could take these same concepts, and it's kind of a weird thing to think of. This is just me going off the top of my head, but it is kind of an interesting thing to ponder is if deception is all about influencing the behavior of somebody, could we use some of those same approaches to try to change the behavior in a positive way of our users? I don't know. I just off the top of my head thought, but it might be an interesting thing to play around with. Interesting thing to play around with. Awesome. So, Lance, this has been really awesome. I appreciate you taking the time to spend the last hour with me, kind of going through this stuff. I absolutely appreciate it. I'll give you one last opportunity. What are your final thoughts, final 2 cents? The floor is yours to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
No, just like emphasized there, ultimately, two key things on security. Always try to take the simplest approach possible. Based on my 20 years, complexity is our biggest enemy, just emphasizing what Bruce Schneier tells us. And 2, we can't forget about the human. For the past 20 years, we've gotten very good at using technology to secure technology, and we have failed the human, and that is why we continue to lose, and that is precisely what the Verizon DBIR, which just came out this week, once again emphasized.
Absolutely. I could not possibly agree more. So thank you so much. This has been a really, really awesome chat. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. For those of you who are watching, if you enjoyed this, please take a minute, subscribe to the channel, click the little bell thing so you get notifications, hit the little like button, all those kind of fun stuff. You guys know the story. Yeah. So again, thanks a lot, Lance. I really have appreciated it. And everyone, let's all start doing this because as I say at the end of everything, if we start working together, if we start moving in the direction of deception, we can take back the advantage.